Welcome to Forward with NACCE, Inspiring Entrepreneurial Action, a podcast that shares the stories of everyday entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial leaders, and the communities that support us. We hope that this diverse collection of stories brings you inspiration, inspires you to take action, and ignites entrepreneurship in your community as we make our way forward together.
Welcome to Forward with NACCE. We're happy to be coming to you today from our studio and interviewing some special guests. They are entrepreneurs, they're educators, they're authors, and they're doing a lot of very important work in the United States and beyond. So it's my pleasure to welcome our first guest, Elizabeth McBride, who has quite an extensive resume and has been doing some amazing things that our podcast producer actually got to participate in. So Elizabeth, let's start with you. Just share with our audience a little bit about who you are and your background and how you actually got connected to us.
Great. Well, it's a little bit of a winding story, but I'm really happy to be here and with my co-author, Seth Levine, who I know we'll talk with in a minute. So I am a longtime business journalist. I've been a business journalist for more than 2 decades. About 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago now, I got a divorce, which meant that I had to really ramp up my breadwinning capacity to take care of my 2 kids. And the way I met that need was I became an entrepreneur myself, a solopreneur in the beginning. I was a freelance writer, but at a high level, right? There are a lot of people who do freelance writing kind of as a hobby, but I had to make a living doing it. And so I really established a business in that area and did a lot of coverage about the entrepreneurial community around the world. So I was covering entrepreneurs, and I was an entrepreneur myself, kind of growing into the role of an entrepreneur. And that's how I got passionate about it, right? I observed within myself that having that financial responsibility, being a decision maker, was helping me kind of restore my sense of agency. So it was a powerful experience for me. And then in the journey of reporting and being a journalist around the world, when I was reporting in Israel, Palestine, I'll backtrack a little and actually tell the story because it is a story. So I was writing a story about a Palestinian entrepreneur in Ramallah. And he said to me, "You obviously have a passion for entrepreneurship," he said. "So you should meet this investor, this US investor who is investing in Palestinian entrepreneurs who has a similar kind of passion." And that is how I met Seth, who is the co-author of the book that we're going to talk about on the show.
That is a beautiful segue. And I think what I've learned about you, just researching your background a little bit, is, it's taking what could be a challenging, very tough life, circumstance and really turning that into something very positive and the people you meet along the way. So Seth, let's go to you. Maybe you could take us from the point at which you became acquainted to a little bit about your background and how you started working with Elizabeth to write that book, which I know has made such an impression on many, many people, including our producer, Natalia.
One of the many things I love about Elizabeth, and I love hearing that story, and this will come through, I think, to your listeners as we get further into this, she's a master storyteller. And when people ask me, what have I learned from this partnership? Elizabeth and I have been collaborating for about 3 or 4 years now. And I think that's the thing that really stands out to me is just how to capture a story and really make the people come alive. So I hope your listeners will appreciate that as she tells more and more of these stories. And I think about that as she tells the story of our getting together. It's actually a pretty opportune time to be talking about that because I'm leaving in a couple of days to go back to the West Bank to meet up with a bunch of entrepreneurs there and spend some time really on the ground, kind of digging in. In my day job, I'm a venture capitalist. I started a venture firm called Foundry about almost 15 years ago now. I started that with 3 other people, and we've now grown it into a really large platform. We invest in other venture funds, pretty diverse set of venture managers, actually, and then also invest directly into companies. We've done some consumer investing, so that the companies that people have heard of that we've invested in are companies like Fitbit and Whoop, but lots of other kind of more geeky companies that people maybe haven't heard of, that were also very successful. But it's been a fun run. But along the way, I've had an opportunity, as I've done particularly in Palestine and the Middle East, but also in a number of markets in Africa, to really spend time on the ground and try to help promote entrepreneurship as a vehicle for agency and a vehicle for change, which is really what Elizabeth was talking about. And ultimately, as we talk about the book, I mean, that's really what the book is about. It's about the power, the fierce power, as Tyra Banks called it in the foreword, of entrepreneurship, to be that agent for individual change, and ultimately that individual change becomes community change.
Yeah, it's so powerful. It's so interesting to be connected to you, because that's really was my own personal experience working for many years in development and nonprofits, raising millions of dollars to support worthy causes. And when I first started learning about entrepreneurial mindset, it really resonated with me, because I thought, this is success mindset. It really truly can span any discipline, any area. And I think the fact that you both wrote a book about it really kind of opens the door, and you're constantly, learning about things. Later on, we could talk a little bit about NACCE's work to develop and scale an everyday entrepreneur venture fund, which you might be curious to know about. But before we get to that, one of the things, in addition to the book, is that you recently held a very successful conference. And Elizabeth, Natalia was fortunate enough to attend that. So we were talking about that the other day, just some of the takeaways, because I think what I've learned from both of you and from her is really, that sense of agency and really understanding entrepreneurship, but you want to apply it to your life. So Natalia, why don't you jump in and tell us a little bit about the conference that you attended, and maybe a little of your background and what you learned that you're going to apply to your professional and personal life.
Thank you so much. And Elizabeth, yes, Becky, it's just such an opportunity. So when I saw that title, it got my attention, about challenges met opportunities ahead. And the promise was to talk about the future of entrepreneurship. So I had interest from both to attend on behalf of our organization, as well as a person who is interested in the state of entrepreneurship in the United States of America. I personally come from Ukraine, where I spent 18 years working for the US government, US Agency for International Development. And we were also looking into how to develop microenterprise, how to support small business growth there. We look into the profile of entrepreneurs, and we also learned that people who start their business in Ukraine, these are usually 43, 45-year-old people on average. They've got their life, and the entrepreneurship is something for them to either tackle the need, most of all, not so much opportunity, but more the need, because jobs are scarce and it's always challenging. So here, there was such a unique perspective to provide in terms of who are the new builders of economies, who are true entrepreneurs. And then I discovered about the book, The New Builders, the title of the book. I looked it up on Amazon, and they talk about how entrepreneurship is defined, that indeed the future of the economy will depend on how successful these everyday entrepreneurs are. And that was really amazing. Also, your panel talked about where to get funding, how to pitch for the investor, how to get financing. And you provided such great networking opportunities for students, for professors, for university to be in it together. So I enjoyed that particular inclusive spirit of your event, where you shared lessons learned, opportunities, provided networking opportunities, and also you teamed up with such partners as Square, or you offered that additional opportunities for 6 months special bonus for participants. So that was just coming with so many benefits to attend. So thank you for that. And I look forward to hearing more from you about the book and your next plans.
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. And I know we had also talked about that there's a newsletter, Elizabeth, I believe, the Times of Entrepreneurship. So people who are listening, and certainly our thousands of NACCE members around the country, might want to sign up for that. So tell us a little bit about that. You're a journalist, so it's probably not your everyday newsletter. I'm sure it has a lot of very good information. So maybe chat a little bit about what is that like? If people sign up for it, what would they get out of it, and how do they do that?
Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about that. And it's in a constant state of evolvement. I think that's part of the definition of entrepreneurship, right? That it's always iterating. That's the Silicon Valley word for it. But so I founded an organization, kind of this is all grown up together, right? The book and my relationship with Seth and the company I founded. But 3 years ago, when I was kind of coming out of my global work and I wanted to be a bit more rooted in the United States, I talked to the Kauffman Foundation, which is kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the entrepreneurship funding world, about I had an idea for a publication that would really focus on the entrepreneurial mindset. And so they gave me a grant to start a sponsorship for my website. And so I launched just about 2.5 years ago. I went live about almost exactly 2 years ago on February 12th, 2020. And part of what we produce a newsletter, which is free, which has about, at this point, maybe 13,000 subscribers. And they're mostly influencers in the entrepreneurship space. So people like you, policymakers in Washington, like the ones I know you were just meeting with. And then we're just now shifting into growing the base into entrepreneurs themselves. So what you get from signing up with the newsletter we have an opportunity section. That's where you can find funding as an entrepreneur, or also jobs in the entrepreneurship space. And we have some fun stuff in the middle that's sort of like this week we had a woman-owned company that's producing really nice work gloves. I know people are thinking about springtime gardening. So we have a section where you can buy things that you feel good about buying, supporting small and women and people of color owned businesses. And then I write a beginning to it that's just often storytelling, right? It's often a story that I've encountered in my work as a journalist. And lately we've been promoting as well. Seth and I developed Around the New Builders, which is a book really that tells the stories of many, many everyday entrepreneurs. I love that phrase. So it tells the stories of many everyday entrepreneurs across the country. And we've recently developed a free course for college professors teaching entrepreneurship that you can download and use parts of to supplement a course you're already doing, or adopt it as a whole course. So those are some of the things you can find in the newsletter. And I was just to add one more thing, I was really happy that it was our first event that Natalia came to. Because I thought, well, I'm experimenting on what really works to connect with people. And so we're adding events as another big component of what we're doing at Times of Entrepreneurship.
That is quite impressive. And I think that's really where people who embrace, entrepreneurship, and a lot of what we do here is supporting social entrepreneurship, which in some respects, I think you're advancing that as well. But the Kauffman Foundation is one of our sponsors as well. And when we were in Minneapolis in October, they sponsored a policy forum where we had Senator Amy Klobuchar, who chairs the Entrepreneurship Caucus, and others. And Kauffman Foundation was instrumental in getting that started a number of years ago. So it occurs to me that really the power of moving forward is connecting these networks of networks and people who share sort of that passion and that spirit, and thinking about not what separates us, but what kind of unifies us. And I wanted to go to you, Seth, for a moment, because people might, you have sort of an image of, venture capitalists, and what that's like. And sometimes, it can be sort of ominous, So share with us a little bit about what is a venture capitalist, sort of how do you interpret that? And maybe how do you find businesses that are ones that you, and I imagine your partners want to invest in?
One of the things we talk about in the book is this divide that exists between, I love this term as well, everyday entrepreneurship and sort of the world of, I'll say Silicon Valley. Obviously, entrepreneurship, tech entrepreneurship has expanded well beyond Silicon Valley. But when I started in venture 20 years ago, it was very much focused on Silicon Valley and perhaps to some extent in Boston as well. But there's this sort of gap in perception and frankly, gap in reality about what's happening, right? And this view that entrepreneurship really means tech entrepreneurship. There's actually an interesting history to that we talk about in the book. Ronald Reagan sort of usurped and narrowed the term entrepreneurship to mean tech entrepreneurship. Of course, he had previously been the governor of California, really at the birth of Silicon Valley. So he understood what was happening there, and he used it as a diplomatic tool and would sort of go around the world and talk about sort of the US capitalist system and use this entrepreneurship idea, but really try to narrow it down to be just tech entrepreneurship. And in the 40 or 50 years since, we've kind of let that continue to slide. And one of the things that we really push hard on in the book is that entrepreneurship is a very inclusive term and needs to be an inclusive term. It used to be a few hundred years ago, it referred to really anyone who was starting their own business or working for themselves. And frankly, back then, that was pretty much everyone in the United States, because it's only been in the last 150 years or so that people started really working for other corporations. For the most part, back a few hundred years ago, as the country was settled and ultimately colonized, people sort of made for themselves, right? They were shopkeepers or farriers or blacksmiths, or they were farmers, et cetera. And so we talk about that a lot in the book, and that gulf kind of exists as well. I think even in the question that you asked, and this perception of sort of venture capital as this sort of weird thing that's way out there. And one of the things that I'm proud of that predates the New Builders and the work that Elizabeth and I did together, but that my partners and I have done, particularly my partner Brad Feld, who some of your listeners might have heard of. We really have spent decades now trying to sort of unmask the mysticism of venture capital. And we've done that through our writing, through a number of books that sort of talk about sort of the ins and outs of venture and try to make it more accessible and less scary. There used to be this perception in the venture world that the asymmetry of information worked to VC's advantages. And that we believe is pernicious, right? You should not win by taking advantage of other people. And so that's why we tried to shine a light on that. Now, the truth is venture-backed businesses represent about 1% of all companies in the United States. So they're important companies, and they're building technology that support many everyday entrepreneurs, but it's a very thin slice of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I think one of the things that we think is really important for people to understand is that 99% of businesses need to get funded in a different way. And need to grow in a different way. And so we talk a lot about that in the book. These are the everyday entrepreneurs, the Main Street entrepreneurs, the grassroots entrepreneurs, to pick a few names to call them, but the people that are really starting the vast majority of businesses in the United States. And the truth is, and this is interesting, almost all of the job growth in the US comes from these small businesses. Yes. They constitute nearly 50% of GDP, 40% of employment, and essentially 100%. This was actually a Kaufman study that suggested this, and it's been updated a few times. But really, 100%, or maybe even more than 100% of the job growth in the U.S. comes from businesses, comes from these small businesses. Really important economic engine for us.
Yeah, I think what you said is so powerful, and your book, I think, illuminates that. One of the things that my colleagues and I did during the pandemic, we too published a book by the name of Impact Ed, How Community Colleges Create Equity and Prosperity. And we did similar to what you did. We took the stories of everyday entrepreneurs and sort of looked at how could you be somebody who does not have access to capital, yet still kind of join the entrepreneurial community, because in a sense, you're creating your own job, right? And what we found, mostly through the philanthropic side, through individuals, Chip and Stuart Weissmiller's put up $1 million of their own money to sort of do a proof of concept. But what we found in the creation of 100 everyday businesses is that generally it would take between $5,000 and $8,000, and support from the community college, mentoring. A lot of these businesses can be cash positive in about 3 months. And during the pandemic, because they got the wraparound support for community colleges, they were able to survive. Some of them had to pivot. They had to do different things. They had to reinvent themselves. But I think the more people like yourselves and us that are writing and trying to get the word out, it's really where we get to that conversation about equity, inclusion, and ultimately belonging. So you may not live in Chicago or Silicon Valley or New York, but you can still be part of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So I thank both of you for the work that you're doing. I thank you also for connecting to NACCE. In fact, Elizabeth, one of your reporters that works for you, did just a phenomenal job. I think at your suggestion reached out to us and wrote a beautiful piece that we were able to share out widely with our network. So it's our hope that people will read your book, sign up for your newsletter, and do more connecting so that together we can kind of advance things. But as we kind of wind short on time, I wanted to really get your sense of how what you are hopeful for about in the future. We're hopefully going to get some good news on this pandemic, but we're 2 years in. So Elizabeth, let's start with you, and then let's go to Seth and tell us a little bit about maybe what you learned during the pandemic and what you're hopeful for in the future.
Well, first, I just want to say I love hearing that you wrote a book during the pandemic. I think there are some of us who I think are just so, well, first of all, love our work and are just kind of like productive by nature, right? So during the pandemic, I had to keep going. So it's nice to meet somebody else in that kind of, in that vein. And what I would say is what I'm really hopeful about, and one of the reasons that we're shifting, or not shifting, adding events. And I'm happy to say too that Seth is going to be an investor in the events side of Times of Entrepreneurship. But one of the things I'm most hopeful about is that as we come back together physically, that it will mean that we're coming back together as a country. And that in that kind of personal interaction, and as we're sharing all of the myriad things we learned about ourselves during the pandemic, which was a time of so much introspection, I'm really hopeful that we'll take that and it will become just a time of healing for the country.
Yes, beautiful. Seth, how about you?
Oh, it's hard to follow that.
Sorry.
I'm used to it. Elizabeth always has these profound things to say, and then I'm stuck trying to follow up on it. But
Seth, maybe we could pivot a little bit, and maybe some tips that you could provide, because I agree with you. That was so beautifully said, and I've been inspired by the things that you've said. But if people were to write down one or two things, just that maybe they could do, that follow the example of what you're doing to kind of, constantly be working and reinvent themselves, that might be really helpful for our listeners.
sure.
Yes, I love that, because Seth is like, Seth is a constant doer. I'm a doer. I feel like Seth is like at a higher level of getting things done in the world. So
Elizabeth once described it as being in a small room with a tornado.
Yeah.
There's a lot. There's a lot happening. No, that's true. Before I do that, I will say the word that comes to mind frankly, about our economy, but in particular about new builders, is resilience. And I think we're actually seeing this. Certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, I'm sure this will not be a surprise to anyone listening. We know that businesses started by women and people of color disproportionately were affected by the pandemic. Something like 40% of Black-owned businesses went out of business in the first handful of months of the pandemic. But actually, we're seeing the opposite now happen as we're starting to come a little bit out of the pandemic. And I think that, and so the number of businesses started by women and people of color, and particularly Black women, who really are the economic engine that is pretty much the most important component of the overall US economic engine. But the number of businesses that they're starting is increasing incredibly rapidly. And so it just speaks to the resilience and fortitude of new builders. And I think that's, if I took anything away from the pandemic, it was this sense of hope and sense of resilience. And I think that we found ourselves quite optimistic about the future of entrepreneurship, even though we talk about some trends that are maybe alarming or troubling. And I think it's because we spent so much time with new builders and we interviewed them and we got to know them. We got to know them before the pandemic, and then we, then through the pandemic, that we really came away feeling so proud about it. So there's a few things that I think people could consider doing. And I would put them in a couple different categories, but let's start for people that want to help new builder businesses, Main Street businesses, everyday entrepreneurs. For starters, we talk about recognizing these everyday entrepreneurs, right? Walking into a shop and realizing that the person sitting behind the counter very well may be the owner. That means that they are not just the person behind the counter, but they're also doing the merchandising and probably the accounting at night. And as entrepreneurs do, having many, many hats. I've had wonderful conversations with people in businesses where I've walked in, not in a hurry to do something necessarily, not in a transactional mode, but wanting to learn a little bit more about them. And not necessarily being there to take a couple of pictures of some tags so I could later go buy it online. I mean, that's sort of obvious, but we heard from many new builders that that people do that all the time. And I think that allowing new builders a little bit of agency and a little bit of grace, I think it's a great place for people to start. But on top of that, one of the things that we talk about, and I think this will resonate just given the work that you do, is helping open up networks to other people. And I think one of the things that Elizabeth and I have spent a lot of time doing as we've kind of bridged these worlds of everyday entrepreneurship and, kind of our day jobs, working in venture and sort of more the Silicon Valley tech entrepreneurship mold, and in Elizabeth's case, reporting on that, is trying to bridge those two things by opening up networks. And then lastly, capital, of course. And we talk a lot in the book about the need to get more capital to more new builder businesses. That could be as simple as making a deposit, opening up a savings or checking account at a community bank. It's a great way to support everyday entrepreneurs. Community banks do a very good job of lending, better job than other banks of lending to new builders. And for every dollar that's deposited, somewhere between $5 and $10 gets loaned out. So that's a great way to get leverage, and you can earn some interest on that as well. So you could do something as simple as that. There's also a bunch of platforms that will allow you to invest, might be as little as $100 at a time. If you have more, then more, into Main Street businesses. I'm thinking about platforms like Mainvest, but there's a handful of them out there they're not Kickstarter. You're actually getting some return on it. But it enables you to invest in these sorts of businesses. And then lastly, for anyone that sort of has some political connections, you talked about the symposium that you did, Becky, with Senator Klobuchar, is really kind of holding the political feet to the fire, as it were, around entrepreneurship. Members of both parties like to talk about the importance of entrepreneurship in small business and then do absolutely nothing about it. And one of the things that we talk about a lot in the book is that this balance between big business and small that we've always sort of had in the US and ebbs and flows over time, but we're in a state of imbalance now. And part of the reason that we are imbalanced is because we don't have policies that support new businesses and everyday entrepreneur endeavors. And that's something that we need to change. And for those people that do end up having access to people who pull the political purse strings, as it were, reminding them of the real importance of these businesses to our economy, and being thoughtful about the ways that we can help support them through policy or through not having policies that harm them, right? We don't necessarily just need things that will support them. We also need to take away things that are imbalanced and favor bigger businesses, both in the tax code, the regulatory frameworks, and otherwise in our government. So those are some ideas that people might think about. Maybe one thing resonates with them. Hopefully, at least see new builders and be kind to them and acknowledge them. And the power of just saying to someone, tell me about your business. How did you start this? So I love what you've done here. This piece of merchandise is beautiful. Like, that is so energizing to them and makes them feel seen and recognized.
That is so powerful, because really it is all about relationships. And you're right. We all need to be advocates. I shared with you, I just flew back from DC attending an advocacy workshop of really not only advocating for community colleges, but my goal was to advocate for entrepreneurship at community colleges, because it's the big equalizer. So I am definitely going to read your book. I'm looking forward to our networks supporting one another. And I want to thank both of you and Natalia also for this wonderful conversation. I hope it's the first of many. One of the things that we do is we do a really big celebration for Global Entrepreneurship Week. So I'm hoping we can have you both back in November, and we can learn from you about what you've seen around the world that people can apply to their everyday lives. So thank you so much. I wish you all a very good day, and thanks to our listeners around the world.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. It was such a pleasure.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful conversation.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope that you will continue to explore the many ways to define entrepreneurship with NACCE as we celebrate opportunity, failing forward, and success, learning from one another along the way. Subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform and follow at NACCE on social media, and learn more about us at nacce.com/podcast. Stay tuned for a new episode each week. We look forward to making our way forward together with you. Have you heard about our latest book, Impact Ed: How Community College Entrepreneurship Creates Equity and Prosperity? This is our roadmap for building back better in 50 states and globally. In each chapter, we share the inspiring stories of everyday entrepreneurs and explain how community colleges play a crucial role in their success. Visit us at NACCE.com/ImpactEd to order your copy now and join us in this work.